Okay, I'm going to start and then let people join us as they do. And welcome everyone to another Page Views Live webinar. For those of you who haven't been here before, I just want you to know that this is an ongoing series. We're trying to do it monthly now, and it just has some background in the fact that Film Quarterly has this wonderful feature called Page Views, edited by Bruno Guaraná, who's here with me. And each issue, we take up a different book. And the current issue, our summer volume 74, number 4, is a conversation between Bruno and our guest today, Philip Scepanski, and a discussion of Philip's book, Tragedy Plus Time, National Trauma and Television Comedy. Thanks, Bruno. And welcome, Philip. Great to have you.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to alert everyone to the fact that every single time the conversation, the Page Views conversation goes up on the web, it's free. You can read it there. You can share it with folks. And if you look closely at the end of the article, the end of the conversation, you will find that there is a link to a chapter from the book. And in this case, this very excellent introduction by Philip to this whole discussion, this whole notion of broadcast nationalism, national trauma, television history, and really the nature of comedy. So it's a huge pleasure to be welcoming both Bruno and Philip here. I don't do long introductions because we post the bios in the chat, so please do pay attention to the chat. But I do want to say that Bruno has been working with us at Film Quarterly. It's entirely enjoyable, but he's just transitioned out of his postdoc at NYU and into a new position as master lecturer up at Boston University and is moving. So if anyone has apartment tips for Bruno, you might let him know. And he'll be introduced. Well, I'll introduce Philip just a bit to say that Philip's at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, for those of you who are not New Yorkers, and has done this wonderful book that started even back, I believe, when he was working on his dissertation. So it's very timely, and I think it's a great moment in this first year after the Trump regime to think about this and to think about these subjects and about television and online comedy. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to turn the podium, as it were, over to Bruno, who's going to give you a sense of the book for those of you who haven't read it. And then we'll begin the conversation. In all, there's an hour, and we'll try to leave some time toward the end for your questions and our conversations with you. So, Bruno, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ruby. Thanks for being with us, Phil, and for sharing the book with us. It's been a pleasure to read it. I have my copy that arrived actually yesterday. I had read it in digital copy. And this is a really interesting and fun read. And as Ruby said, it's super timely. But I just want to give you all a sense of what the book is about from my perspective. And then Phil will have a chance to correct me if I say something that's not particularly appropriate or not really what he meant to say there. But so the core of the book is an investigation by Phil of the function of TV comedy in popular culture, and more specifically regarding its treatment of sensitive topics such as national traumas. The title of the book is Tragedy Plus Time, National Trauma and Television Comedy. And you know, if we think of television news, for example, as performing the role of sometimes creating and reframing collective traumas as national in character, he claims that TV comedy pushes the limits of discourse around these events, fabricated as sacred in the media and elsewhere, right? So TV comedy has the tendency to, as he says, profane the sacred traumas. And in the book, he shows that it's because of TV's narrowing target audiences, its ability to embrace formal experimentations and a tradition of taking risks, that TV comedy is able to bypass the norms of conduct and of propriety that limit speech about tragedies. Of course, as he demonstrates too, sometimes it does this very well, allowing viewers to work through national traumas and to understand its nuances and political causes and implications. And at other times, it can actually contribute to a further alienation. One of the main dangers that he cites of TV comedy is its tendency to segment audiences, often framing certain groups as others, or the butt of the joke, and making them easy targets elsewhere. And another danger is the sense of comfort that comedy may convey, if not necessarily numbing viewers to the reality that surrounds them, at least protects itself from the social responsibility of addressing that reality and its traumas. In my reading of the book, its greatest contribution really is the framework that it provides us with to think about comedy as not just comforting or distracting. It really makes a great case for taking comedy seriously and for considering its ability to reframe and reshape collective trauma, as well as the risks that it takes in doing so. And I should admit that I'm not an avid watcher of television comedy in particular, or some comedy, really. And I think it has to do with my own background and adjusting to the tempo and the culture of humor in American television. So it took me a very long time to sort of get used to SNL's format and the coming to SNL until I started getting it and understanding it. So I'm sort of a accidental viewer of comedy, and what the book allowed me to realize was the value of comedy, right? In discourses about national identity and about national trauma as well, and we'll talk a lot about that today. So to go back a little bit, at the core of the investigation is the temporal distance between tragedy as it is experienced by a collective group and the appearance of humorous discourses about it. So to address national trauma, comedy is ever interested in testing the time that succeeds tragedy. It is always wondering, when is it no longer too soon to speak about any particular event that can be experienced as traumatic? It also seems to me, as Ruby mentioned earlier, that the book comes out at a very appropriate moment. If comedy is often deemed to be overlooked, the Trump era has really changed that, with comedy shows taking over the function of framing and commenting on the social political scenario in the US, while TV journalism remains stuck in the appearance of neutrality. For me personally, the news of the Trump years were not just more digestible through comedy, but also more incendiary, which I think was what the context demanded, and that journalism could not really deliver, right, in its appearance of neutrality and impartiality. And I think it's this elasticity unique to TV comedy that Phil makes so clear throughout the book. And he covers that with an impressive range of examples, some of which we'll hope to discuss today. And at the risk of sounding cheesy, I should note that the tragedy of writing such a book lies in the fact that the more time it passes after the publication, I think the more you think that you should still be writing it. But luckily for us, I think it really functions as a jumping off point that allows us to better understand future iterations of this kind of humor that's still present in American television. And again, and to understand, right, what it means and what it's doing, how it's contributing to national discourses in television and also elsewhere. So I really want to thank you for sharing this with us at this moment in particular, and we'll have some questions about what this book means today for you, especially in vis-a-vis the moment in which you started working on it during your PhD program. But I wanted to start actually with the title of the book. How did you arrive at this idea of tragedy plus time, and what exactly you're trying to get to here?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for that incredibly kind, generous introduction, and for having me and selecting my book to talk about in Film Quarterly. The title, I was sort of trying to save my clever title, so I didn't want to waste it on the dissertation. And I was sort of, poking around at all these different kind of cliches to give it to the title, but it's one of those things, and I mentioned a little bit in our interview back in February that I'm working now a little bit more explicitly on issues of temporality. And so one of the things that I kept running into in writing this book was, yes, these questions of when does it become okay to joke about these things, and in both macro and micro terms. So the first chapter after the introduction is specifically about when do jokes about the Kennedy assassination start to appear on TV. It's about 20 years after 1963. And even then, it's sort of in fringe times, right, before it starts to move into prime time by way of shows like Seinfeld and Family Guy. But then on this sort of more micro level too, right, there's this question of, well, days or months after, an event like 9/11 or George Floyd, I don't think we're seeing a lot of, certainly not sick jokes about George Floyd yet, if we ever do on television. But even that, it's more complicated. You can't just put a timer on it because it does happen in sort of different venues with different audiences. So, I note in the book, in live comedy, Lenny Bruce is making jokes about Kennedy's assassination day of that evening. And magazines like the National Lampoon are making jokes about the Kennedy assassination, maybe a decade later. But TV, waits until 1983 on SNL with Eddie Murphy sort of killing himself in a strange way. He plays a version of Lee Harvey Oswald that assassinates buckwheat in also very much a nod to the Reagan shooting in '83.
So it's a mixture of sort of references, right? That you're reading is particularly about JFK as well.
Yeah, so it's this pastiche, right? So Reagan had been shot, as had John Paul II and John Lennon, right? Which I sort of note that they all have their kinds of connections to Kennedy through, being representative of Roman Catholicism, obviously being president, and being this kind of symbol of 60s optimism. And so, right, it seems to be commenting on this rash of shootings, attempted and successful assassinations in the early 80s. But then they start to kind of push it in the direction of the Kennedy assassination. First, I think by kind of noting the funereal coverage that was, famously done in 1963. Famous, I guess, among maybe TV historians more than the general public. But then also by turning Buckwheat's killer into a very Lee Harvey Oswald type figure, up to and including actually restaging the Oswald shooting that happened on live television in 1963.
And you use JFK as sort of a key moment in television history for starting to address these traumas. What is significant about this time for television practices that perhaps, I guess this time, I mean the 80s, right? When the trauma is finally being addressed, that makes this such a particular moment in TV history?
Yeah, well, it's a narrative that started off somewhat simple and has been complicated in various ways by TV historians since then. But there's this sense, sometime around between about 1975 and 1980, we make this cutoff between what we call the network and the post-network era. And so the kind of key differences here are, well, one, you've got cable television happening, and that's kind of the main one. The Fox network begins in the mid 80s, is followed a bit later by UPN and WB. But there's these other technologies that are competing for TV time, including home video game systems, VCRs, and just, various other kinds of home entertainment options are arriving on the scene during that time. So, the sort of going logic is the audience for any particular show is getting smaller and smaller as television fractures into more channels and basically just more things to do with your TV. So the idea is that TV shifts from this broadcasting to what's called in the industry narrowcasting, which is that you start to concern yourself much less with trying to speak to the broadest possible audience, and you start trying to target particular demographics, which certainly a business logic that has continued up to the present, and TV just keeps getting ever more specific in its appeals.
Mm-hmm.
I think I didn't quite finish your question, right? Which is then, so you can have stuff that we would today characterize as like this CBS sitcom, which is an incredibly kind of conservative, stylistically conservative comedy, that you would tend to think is shooting more for the 50 and up kind of demographic. But then a network like Fox can really try to target a more young, edgier demographic, which is to say nothing of like Adult Swim and Comedy Central, whose target is very much like 18 to 25 kind of stoner men, like who I was when I was writing the dissertation. Not so much a stoner,
Oh,
but,
confession, a
but a
moment of
younger man.
confession.
I was a drunk, but not a stoner. So
you mentioned something, use the term sick joke, which you use throughout the book to write the idea of sick comedy. And I was very interested about that. I didn't get a chance to ask you that in our published interview, but I was curious, what is sick comedy and who defines comedy as sick, right? Where does the term come from?
Yeah, so this is a term that pops up around the middle of the century, and I need to give credit to Ethan Thompson and his book that I'm going to go to my cheat sheet so I get it right. Parody and Taste in Post-War American Culture. So he writes about, right, that it's this term, and it really pops out of this idea that to make these kinds of macabre jokes is a sign of mental illness of some kind. And in many ways, right, some of the kind of founders of, what is considered sick early on do represent that in kind of more literal ways where, Jonathan Winters actually was institutionalized on and off throughout his life. Lenny Bruce, had obviously issues with addiction and mental illness. But it also just then kind of, the meaning of it expands to just sort of represent a general kind of rebellious humor that was going on among the older silent generation and the upcoming boomers, right, who were, especially in the 60s, starting to be seen as this particularly kind of rebellious generation. So, someone like Mort Saul, who is not particularly sick in the sense of morbid or crossing boundaries with dead baby jokes or anything like that. But he's making sort of trenchant political critiques through his comedy. And he's the Jon Stewart of the 1960s in many ways. And go ahead.
Yeah, no, can I jump in? Can I usurp your role for a second, Bruno?
Sure.
I just wanted to get you to comment as you're going through this about the very obvious gendering of this kind of comedy and the way in which it's basically white men taking up this role and finding, I would say, a kind of power through this kind of leveraging of taboos. And so it was interesting to me that even though that's what you're describing, you started the book by referencing Dick Gregory at the Friars Club tribute to Hugh Hefner. So I'm wondering about the ways in which gender and race and sexual identity get reflected through this history.
Yeah, and I think it's also would be a disservice to leave out Jewish identity within this narrative as well.
Good point.
A lot of the work on this around this time is thinking about the ways in which a kind of specifically Jewish type of humor is entering into the mainstream and then becomes something more generally American over the course of the ensuing 70 years or so. I'm not a particular expert in sort of early to mid 20th century Jewish culture, so I hesitate to comment on that as directly. There are some women that get kind of caught up in this group, although they're not the sort of numbers 1, 2, and 3 that get mentioned when we talk about this stuff. To some extent, Phyllis Diller is sort of considered part of this class. Apologies if my computer is making noise. I thought I shut everything. But even Phyllis Diller, right, is maybe expressing some level of kind of distaste with expectations about domestic life for women in the mid-century, but she's certainly not crossing boundaries the way a Lenny Bruce would be, right? So, and in general, right, certainly until more recently, the women were the exception in comedy, and comedy as a kind of subculture has been, yes, Elaine May is another big one that gets brought up.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah.
Yes. absolutely. That comedy as a culture is hostile towards women, right? It's to be working in clubs in this era, and still to today in many ways, is a very uncomfortable and unfriendly place to be for women. There is a kind of longstanding assumption that women aren't funny or aren't as funny. And I think we can certainly point to the notables along the way, but there's also just, when you have essentially a hostile work environment, there is a natural weeding of people who just get harassed out of the industry. And so that's a big part of it too. But you're absolutely right. It is in the sort of larger way that it gets talked about, it is this very much presenting the rebelliousness of it as a generational issue, and really not working through, I think, some of the bigger points you're talking about. Dick Gregory certainly comes up, but the other sort of major comedian of this period is Bill Cosby. And obviously the history there, the way we think about him has changed, but Cosby through the 60s, and really up until the present, was the opposite of sick, right? I mean, he was the most kind of like safe, uncontroversial.
Right.
That was part of
we
his.
thought. So we
Yeah,
thought.
right. I mean, that was his performance certainly, right, in the stricter sense of like the persona he put on stage. And that was kind of his response to civil rights, right, was to sort of adopt this very kind of middle class sensibility in order to, kind of break those barriers and, become Bill Cosby, which culminates in the Cosby Show and everything it stood for in terms of Reagan's 1980s, right?
Yeah, and you actually mentioned later on how certain television shows that featured all Black casts were particularly fitting to address the LA riots in 92, right? Could you talk a little bit about that, how that moment constituted a national trauma, and how it was, I think you deemed appropriately addressed by these TV shows?
Yeah, this is, again, the sort of moment of thinking about, 1992 as a moment within the bigger sort of move towards narrow casting. And here I'm going to highlight Herman Gray's work, which is pretty foundational to thinking about this. And he talks about this sort of moment that's happening in the early 90s. It's, partly that the Cosby Show was such a phenomenon in the 80s that it sort of gave permission to the networks to make more Black cast shows. It's not to say that there weren't shows like Good Times in the 70s and in earlier periods. And even, Good Times starts off much more sort of run by white producers, but over the period of, and this I'll highlight Christine Ockham's book, which sort of talks through this too, that over the course of its run, some of the talent on the show, particularly, I'm never sure how to pronounce her last name, but Esther Roll, who played the maternal matriarch of that family, actually sort of asserts her star power to try to make it a more kind of responsible show in terms of representation. But by the time you get to the early 90s, there's this confluence of, okay, the Cosby Show has kind of convinced everyone that you can bank on Black cast sitcoms. The audience is narrowing. Fox network now exists. Cable is becoming more common in households. And there's also this kind of flowering of, or this renaissance around both, I think hip hop is really entering the mainstream, but also you have the New Jack cycle of movies, right? So there's all this stuff going on, and it leads to, most notably, I would say shows like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and In Living Color. People don't talk about it as much, but there is a spin-off of the Cosby Show that was actually probably, in my book, better than the other ones, called A Different World, which took place at a historically Black college. And then on cable, and this one doesn't quite fit the narrative as closely because it's HBO, which is kind of the most narrow appeal of any of these, but Def Comedy Jam, which is particularly this like, well, what if we took the this sort of aesthetic and attitude of the dangerous, we'll say anything kind of hip hop of the early 90s and apply it to comedy. And that show aged so well. When I went back and watched it, because when I was younger, all I ever heard about it was that they cursed a lot. And so my sort of impression of it was like, well, there wasn't much substance to it. But that was the sort of discourse for a kid who didn't have HBO growing up, that's what I knew about it. But to actually go back and watch them, like, they're genuinely funny, and so many important comics, that later became really famous come up through that show. But each of them is kind of engaged in their own address. And I should also say, right, this moment of 1992 is absolutely not the first time there was an uprising around civil rights issues. Most notably, I think we point to like 65 and Watts. There's the long hot summer of 1967, where over 100 US cities had pretty major moments of civil disorder. And then there's it's called the Holy Week uprising of 1968, which happens after Martin Luther King is assassinated. So, but the shows that were on during that time, probably the most notable would be the show called Julia, which was a very kind of Cosby-ish approach of, well, we're going to put Black people on TV and we'll kind of deal with these issues, but certainly in no way that is controversial. Actually, I mean, one other show that sort of jumps to mind that people don't talk about much is Hogan's Heroes, which was winning all these NAACP awards in the mid-'60s because the one Black character was the most kind of responsible, and actually the one character that wasn't really funny because he was too like good at his job to be funny within that show. But an aside. So by the time you get to 1992, you have this confluence, right? Where, okay, we have narrow enough audience that we can sort of justify these shows. We've got this particular kind of mode of Black culture happening by the early 90s. And then Rodney King happens, right? This is also this kind of like the last gasp of a feeling of how people of color suffered under Reaganism, right? So this is in the sort of waning years of the first Bush presidency. And what I didn't mention, and I didn't really talk about it much in the chapter, although I wrote about it in a separate article that came out in TV New Media late last year, that Arsenio Hall was also a really important moment during this period. And he was very clearly sort of coming out on the side of Clinton during this era, where Clinton famously plays saxophone on his show, in a way that Carson was always much more neutral politically. So I actually went back and watched the sort of month of Carson during the Rodney King uprising, and he doesn't mention it at all. It's also the last month before he retires. So, right, Carson is much more in this mode of like, well, let's look at my career of the last 30 years instead of sort of dealing with these significant issues.
Right.
Fascinating.
There's actually a quick aside, is the earliest instance that I've found of someone doing the joke where they say something and say too soon is Carson used to do that fairly frequently, but he'd make a joke about the Lincoln assassination, and then the audience would boo and he'd say too soon. So, that's going back to like the 70s.
Wow.
So it's sort of answering your question, right? That these different shows, right, whether they're a kind of domestic sitcom, are dealing with this issue in a more kind of conservative way, like, middle class African Americans need to commit to rebuilding the neighborhood, whereas a show like Def Comedy Jam can be much more kind of blatant about, I'm pissed about this and I'm going to tell you about it.
I have to put a plug in for something that probably nobody, including yourself, has heard of. It wasn't TV, it was a film. It was Nancy Savoca, the filmmaker, did a piece about Reno, the downtown lesbian comic. And it was made right after 9/11, and it was called Reno, Rebel Without a Pause. And it was all about her experience of 9/11 as a stand-up comedy routine. And I actually showed it on the first anniversary of 9/11, 2002 at Toronto Film Festival. I was curating then for them. And it was, I mean, a lot of people couldn't take it. And I thought it was just fantastic because she talked about things like how ugly everybody always thought the World Trade Towers were and they hated them. So who cared that those were gone, except for the people that died? And I mean, she just made the most irreverent jokes. It was definitely too soon, but not for me.
Jean Baudrillard writes a short piece, right? The same thing about the Twin Towers being these sort of, unholy monuments to like reproducible punch cards, essentially. Right? And so, I mean, this is a sort of one thing that's really fascinates me about what comedy can do sometimes is like, okay, where can you go to find someone making these kinds of critiques, right? It's like, well, you got Baudrillard and you've got this one stand-up comedian, right? Sort of saying these things. Right?
Speaking truth.
Yeah. Well, a truth of a sort.
Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking of too soon, what's a good example of a moment in television that went too far and maybe too soon in your view, or maybe that in its address of trauma it actually wasn't successful, right? Did something that was worse than not doing anything.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm generally not. I tend to find those moments more fascinating than I would sort of like cast aspersions at them personally. I could imagine plenty of situations where someone would potentially make a joke that doesn't work out that way. I guess, I mean, one of the examples I frequently point to, and actually I can sort of tie this to the present as well, are jokes about like gun violence and school shooting. And I probably lean on this example too heavily throughout sort of making this argument, but I always point to this example of a Family Guy joke it's a Columbine joke, essentially. And it's like 8 or 9 years after Columbine, but it's still within the midst of this 25 now year ongoing debate about gun violence in schools and access to guns and things like that. And I think a lot of gun control advocates, myself included, would say that there's some value in remaining kind of raw and hurt about these things, because how are we ever going to make progress on this if we just sort of get back to normal every time it happens, right? And there's a kind of cynical way too, where you can say like, well, it's not okay to sort of talk seriously about this because it's too soon, right? So that's the kind of the conservative approach of like, how dare you politicize this so quickly?
Yes.
And more recently, I have this piece, and I don't know if I'll ever finish it because I don't exactly know what I want to make out of it. But I'm looking at some of the ways in which late night comedies, in their role that they are kind of the first entertainment programs, typically to deal with a trauma, we're sort of negotiating the normalization of COVID. And everything from doing shows from the producers' homes, right? And the kind of like message that sends for those of us who are expected to like continue grading papers, even though we thought the world was ending and things like that. Right. The kind of need to continue being a capitalist, produce value for capitalism, even though the world was falling apart in front of us. But one of the other things I've sort of been thinking about is, well, it seems to me that anxiety and a sense of kind of mourning over COVID was useful if it got people to wear masks, to stay home, to get their shots, right? And we're still dealing with the fallout of people who, like, honestly, for lack of a better term, just aren't scared enough. Right. And so, one of the things I sort of think about the emotional work that comedy does is it kind of tends to return us to baseline. It's cognitively, and I don't have any science to back this up or anything, but it seems to me that cognitively, the moment of finding something funny is kind of like, it's kind of exclusive, right? You sort of, it sort of decenters the self. It's not unlike the Little Death in that sense. And so, go ahead.
No, I'm thinking it's interesting that the examples that you gave are both, they're not over, right? So in a sense, the recurring streak, the ongoing streak of gun violence in this country and the present risks of COVID, is it not a case of time not having passed enough, right? Like it's too soon because it's still happening in that sense. So we haven't. How can we get over something that's not solved in some ways, right?
That's not ended. That's not ended, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I'll admit, I mean, if someone wants to take shots at my book, I'll give you an option here, is that I do kind of play around and play a little bit flexible with my definition of what trauma is.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some ways, right, I like to think of it as these really kind of iconic moments, like the plane hitting the tower, because it's a sort of common moment that we all have a kind of collective memory of. We are all given the visual memory of that moment because we've seen the footage together.
Right.
And then there are other ones that I will sort of sidestep because, like, well, I've kind of figured everyone talked about MASH dealing with Vietnam enough, and I didn't really want to write that chapter. So I just didn't do that one. And I would sort of justify it as, well, Vietnam was this ongoing kind of crisis that was never really, maybe the Tet Offensive, but was never really like a trauma. But then at the same time, I'll use, gun violence. But, in a way you could say, well, okay, Columbine was the trauma and ongoing violence is maybe the crisis, if you want to sort of start to draw.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's almost that the trauma is so ongoing that we're almost back in the land of how do you feel something when there's this much daily battering going on. I'm curious how you draw the line between whether you've had problems with this, between the comedy kind of taking this down and the whole question of triggering. Because I think there's a new set of borders that are being placed around comedy that hadn't necessarily been there before, and that there's a language for that. Though I often don't agree with the charges, there's certainly a new language that you have to contend with.
Yeah, it can get tough, especially, it's one thing for me to sort of talk about like, well, 9/11 jokes or dead Kennedy jokes, but it is really another thing, especially, considering who I am, to start thinking about, well, like, how do people joke about like a civil rights assassination, or how do people talk about like the Pulse nightclub shooting, right? I mean, some of those things still are just like relatively off limits for TV. Rare exceptions, there was a show called The Boondocks that in its
The Boondocks
season
was great. Yeah,
got a ton of flack because it had an episode where they imagined that Martin Luther King had been in a coma and not actually died. And so part of that was that he comes back and says that the proper response to 9/11 would be kind of a more pacifistic response than what we had. And so he gets labeled a commie and kind of run out of town. But then, most famously, or the reason this episode was so controversial was he kind of gets up on stage and calls Black people the N-word and tells them to get their act together. And I actually used to use that in class, and I mainly wanted to talk about these, because I teach a class called Crisis and Catastrophe that's not exclusively about comedy, but it's about the way TV deals with this stuff. And so I wanted to talk about these sort of fantasies where the trauma itself didn't happen, right? And the idea that MLK survived was a good example of that. But it's, and I teach at a primarily kind of white upper middle class school. I just got so uncomfortable. I kept like, eventually I cut off that end scene because that wasn't really what I wanted to focus on. And then I was like, oh, there's all this other stuff in here. And I kind of didn't want to do that. So like, even me, the kind of like the guy who dabbles in this most offensive stuff, I'm concerned about what both that I don't want to get in trouble for it before I have tenure, but I think it legitimately sort of ethical questions about like how my upper middle class white students, I sort of had this question of like, okay, this semester I have one Black student in my class and everyone else is white. And like, this is going to be really kind of terrible. And so I don't want to be that professor in some ways. So, and I think in a lot of ways, I've also grown up over I took too long to get my proposal out and stuff because I have anxiety issues, I guess. But I really grew up over the course of writing this, and I can think back to arguments I was making at conferences and stuff, when I was in grad school about, actually it's good that Daniel Tosh made this terrible rape joke because it caused us all to have an important conversation about rape, and got it on the agenda in a way that like actual violence doesn't. And I look back at that argument and I cringe at myself, right? And sort of be like, some people might want to make that argument, but I'm not the one that, I'm not the one who's sort of like dealing with the trauma of being a victim. So,
Well, you're really touching on this really basic question with comedy. I mean, who deserves ridicule, and who gets to deliver it? Who's allowed the stage to deliver that ridicule, and what targets are they allowed to launch it at? And I think these are some of the fundamental questions that have shifted with, I mean, you're talking about television, then you're talking about cable, you're talking about the post-network era. But now that we're in this post-cable era of streaming and comedy platforms like TikTok, it seems to have shifted all over again, no? Has it changed those parameters, though, or is it just reproducing them?
No, I mean, I think, I think what it does more than anything is it speaks more to these kind of subcultures that have always existed, right? Or I sort of call them subnational communities.
That's great. I love that. Yeah.
Right, because there are these groups, they're like national in some ways, but they don't make up the entirety of American identity, right? So African Americans, for example. But I think, another thing that we need to contend with is the reality of kind of intersectional analysis, to think about, it's very easy to point to like QAnon believers, for example, or certain groups of like straight white men who feel like they're losing their rights, and be like, well, they're just arguing for continuation of hegemony, without recognizing that in certain of these situations, like the people that tend to believe in QAnon are probably not our most like wealthy and educated white guys, right? And there are times in which like, depending on the group, someone who we would typically sort of hold up as like, oh, that's a person that has a right to punch up because of their identity, is then making, I mean, I talk about someone like Carlos Mencia, in one of the chapters, talking about in terms of Islamophobia, right? Where we'd sort of be like, oh, we love to hear Latinx voices in comedy kind of talking through these issues. Well, but then Carlos Mencia is all about like extreme Islamophobia, and he's incredibly sexist and terrible. He's ableist. His catchphrase is making a noise that would be like a playground taunt for someone who's developmentally disabled. And so you're like, well, I don't know that I'm, Carlos Mencia is not the voice that we want to hear. And so, just thinking through all of these issues that you bring up, and it's also a matter of who your audience is, because I'm trying to think of a good example, but, pick any group, and there are sort of in-group jokes you can make. I mean, I would never claim that like Polish Americans are particularly put upon as a group, but I can make dumb Polak jokes among my family in a way that like it wouldn't be as cool if anyone was kind of doing it in general, right? Or like, I'm an East Coaster now, but I'm a Midwesterner growing up. If my wife and I can joke about like Midwesterners being country rubes or whatever, but if anyone did it here, I would not be. If any of my East Coast friends were sort of doing that, I would get pretty angry. So you just think too about what, say, a show like The Boondocks can say if it imagines its audience to be primarily Black, versus what it starts to mean when it's on a network that is really targeting probably mostly young white men, and the kinds of permissions that it gets or that it gives in making those jokes. I mean, it's the sort of Dave Chappelle question too. And Dave Chappelle continues to get sort of more cringy as time goes on. Certainly he takes 15 years off and kind of forgot to like take notes on what was happening within comedy in the previous 15 years. Still funny, in the book, but in a way that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, so you addressed in the book, you talk about national trauma, right? And you refer to it as sort of like this media fabrication that frames a certain event as national, right, in scope and in character. So we're all supposed to experience it in a similar way. But what you're just talking about really reflects the idea that trauma is experienced differently by different, as you said, subnational groups, right? And I wonder, you see that reflected in the way that comedy addresses a narrower audience, right? And Ruby's example of TikTok, for example, is interesting too, because you have a specific list of followers that you learn to know, right? And that respond to your maybe particular kind of comedy, which I think, as you suggest in the book, like further segments the audiences, right? And separates the way. And I'm wondering if there's a chance for comedy to ever be unifying again, or if we're just moved on to a different mode of address that allows comedy to be perhaps freer in how it addresses certain tragedies or certain events, right?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's always going to be a place for a kind of staid comedy that can at least somewhat appeal to a relatively general audience, even if it's not, I think because maybe we have the government that we have, or the Constitution causes us to think in like 51%. Is a good definition of a sort of national concept, one that like 51% of people have seen or agree to. I think that's something I need to get away from, right? And we maybe think a little bit more in terms of like, well, what might be a mode of comedy that appeals to everyone, or to a larger kind of group. It's hard to say. I'm not Nostradamus. It does seem like that's going to be less and less common,
right?
As you point to, but and thinking too about something like TikTok versus TV. Part of the reason I think this is an interesting question for TV, possibly more than some of the other media that we look at, is that TV, especially American TV, has always been kind of the most censored of our mass media, at least since TV happened. Certainly, films were more censored early on, and they continue to be censored in various ways by the MPAA. But the combination of industry self-regulation plus the kind of ever-present threat of government regulation, which really kicked up as recently as like the mid-2000s after Nipplegate, and continues to be this sort of looming thing. Whereas, anyone on TikTok can do just about anything, as long I'm not much of a TikToker, so I don't exactly know what you would have to do to get a video taken down. But I think it would have to be like pretty clearly illegal, like in the realm of child pornography or something like that, or snuff film or something, to actually get it taken down. So TV's willingness to do these things is always somewhat reined in, and I think there is, and this is going back to the introduction of, there is this longstanding tension in TV between the national and the local. And as much as we can talk about, that TV is really governed by an increasingly kind of narrowcast logic that is not necessarily tied to geography as much as it was at some point. Well, I still watch the local news, and
Yay.
well, I don't know. The local news is not great, to be honest. But you should yay if I said I was watching Democracy Now! On YouTube, probably.
That's all right. I'll take the local.
But we still have local news, and there's still some things in TV that are stubbornly somewhat local. Sports fandom. If I'm in New York, but I pay to be able to pretend like I'm still living in Minnesota, so I can watch the football team, no matter how poorly they're doing specifically. But so there are, and that's the weird example, right? Because it's simultaneously local and national in the way I kind of think about it, experience it. And this one, I have to say, I'm mortified by the fact that somehow in the process of turning the dissertation into the book, I had a pretty big chunk where I gave a decent amount of credit to Victoria Johnson's book, Heartland TV, and a lot of the ways that she sort of thinks through, again, these tensions of like regional versus national identity on television. And somehow I lost a paragraph that took out my citations of her. And so I need to go and tell her at some point, like, you were super important to my thinking on that, but somehow you didn't get cited in the book.
I want to pick up on TikTok though, because two of the people that got me through the end of the Trump years and this horrible kind of interregnum of the actual Biden presidency were Sarah Cooper and Blair Erskine. doing their, news clips and enacting their like just scary imitations that were actually factual. I mean, Sarah Cooper just stayed with the script, just put Trump into the body of a black woman. And Blair Erskine just, takes it one step further than the person was willing to disclose. And I don't know if you know them in particular, but I wonder what you think about that kind of comedy now on TikTok.
Well, it's funny because when you heard, people like John Oliver talking about doing comedy during this period, he said, people would walk up to him and say things like, "Oh, it must be so great. You barely have to work anymore to write this stuff." And he would say, "No, it's impossible because like, what am I going to do to make this any funnier or more absurd, right? There's like nothing I can do with this." And so, and I know Sarah Cooper is somewhat better than Blair Erskine, but Sarah Cooper was this, it's fascinating in its minimalism, right? I mean, all it really did was sort of make it new, or if I can coin a term, like re-oddify it or make it odd again.
That's good. Defamiliarization is a
Sure,
time-honored.
that's maybe a better word.
Right. Oh, look, Peter Coons just jumped in with that as well. Yeah, that's a time-honored tradition in the discourse.
Yeah. So I mean, in that sense, I mean, she's doing a kind of, again, to sort of make these connections between what I think, cultural critics and academics are doing. She's doing a kind of like, a kind of cultural anthropology move there in terms of the defamiliarizing, right? Where she's making the familiar strange. In a way that, it was strange to us all in 2015, and at some point it became normal. And so, yeah, right. But in a weird way, like just sort of slightly repackaging it, and hardly at all. Is there anything specific to any of those videos that I ever saw that, created particular meanings about that it was coming out of a black woman's mouth? I don't know that it was, right? I mean, it was never, I can't think of her doing specific speeches that were, particularly talking about how he was the greatest president for black people, or any of those kind of really particular things. It was more about, when it was more like word diarrhea and just the kind of the humor of watching someone sort of work through those ideas as if they kind of were intentional with it. I way back when I was going to say I wasn't seeing the chat for a minute. I way back when the Norman Mailer comment, I don't even know what that was in response to at this point. But.
Yeah. Bruno, any last questions or thoughts?
I was going to, no, I'm going through, the idea that the comedians end up reaching different audiences, right? Or people that might be fed up with the news, and they still got those patterns, I guess, by Trump through a mediated approach that perhaps is easier to digest or to tolerate, right? Because it is already mocking the source. Rather than a newscast that's just reproducing it without any kind of criticism. And one of the things that we try to talk a little bit about in the published interview was the aftermath of January 6th, which had happened as I was reading the book. And again, going back to this idea that you could still be writing this book, and you should be very happy that it's published already, because it's an endless project, right? It has this resonance, and it has these repercussions well beyond its scope. And I'm curious about what you've seen in regards to January 6th and the riots at the Capitol, in television comedy in particular.
Yeah, I mean, mostly what we've seen, hasn't actually changed much since I was, responding to your questions in early February. Which are still the kind of late night shows. And, part of that I think is just that production got shut down and things were relatively slow in the last 6 months or so. I've seen a few kind of references to some of these things, or, some of the kind of late months of Trump, COVID stuff. But it was SNL did a sketch just kind of about how weird the people were. So there's this, comedy is oftentimes it focuses on difference, right? And there's sort of theories of comedy that talk about how comedy is the hammer that corrects the nail that's sticking out too far, right? And so to the extent that the people supporting Trump are weirdos, as far as we can tell, comedy can find something to say about that, even if it's SNL is just not great in this current era we're in. So I don't think it said anything particularly funny or important about it. The one that continually does, I think, the best with kind of current events comedy, well, John Oliver is good, but Seth Meyers, I think is pretty strong in terms of his responses. So he continues to work through this, and he's actually a lot better at holding, like, not just Trump, but kind of other, like, senators and enablers to account in his comedy. It doesn't always sort of land on comedy, though, and that's the thing about doing this current event stuff. And I think there was definitely a moment in the early to mid 2000s where a lot of comedians, like Mark Maron is one that jumps out at me, were they would get on stage and sort of do political, rants, and weren't even really bothering to try to be funny. I said this once online, and some like stand-up comedian friend of Mark Maron kind of came after me and was like, not everything has to be in the form of a joke. And I was like, well, I don't necessarily mean like that it's joke form, but like literally he's not doing humor, right? He's sort of doing political speeches or kind of like essayistic kind of speaking, which is, if that's your thing with Mark Maron, that's great. But I just think Liz Winstead was another one around this time that just kind of like stopped trying to be funny. And so, I mean, that's always a question too, especially around these moments where you oftentimes see, TV comedy comes back and almost apologizes for being a comedy. So you famously, Letterman and Jon Stewart come back after 9/11 and do this, but you see this after January 6th, where Seth Meyers and Fallon kind of come back and say, well, we're not really going to do jokes tonight because this is such a serious moment.
But that's so interesting what you said about the difficulty of taking on the powerful and how the humor disappears when you do that. Because I think while the Trump supporters, we may think of as the odd or idiotic, the other Trump supporters who are funding him are not odd or idiotic. They're billionaires sitting in their fancy offices paying for all of his deceptions and illegalities. But then where's the humor in that? And that's like maybe where I land at the end of this hour with you is where does the humor exist and where does the humor disappear? Who gets to make the jokes and who gets to be the brunt of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not just billionaires, or, it's not just an alliance between billionaires and the working class, working class whites. There's also a big chunk of like, middle class, suburban, my parents included, I know, voted for Trump 4 times between the two of them, as far as I'm aware. And I still love them. And so it does sort of force me to try to think of think about the Trump supporters as people too. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, there is a sort of, there is a brand of comedy that does sort of go after like extreme normalcy as its own kind of weirdness. And I guess, my thinking about something like this is almost more like, think about what like Devo was doing in the 80s, which itself is funny, even though it didn't really present as comedy. Is that happening right now? I can't for the life of me think of any particular examples where, the sort of like incredibly mundane middle class, socially liberal, fiscally conservative kind of person is the one that's getting mocked in this way. But maybe that's somehow just not within the realm of my notice at this point.
Well, or comedy has some catching up to do, perhaps. This is an interesting challenge for the future.
It is. I mean, it's a sort of mode of comedy that I think is happening much more so in the 80s. And around it, I mean, it's also happening in certain kinds of meta sitcoms like Get a Life with Chris Elliott. And so my dissertation advisor was Jeff Sconce. So, if people are familiar with his work, it's very much the stuff that he has written about in the past. But I just can't think of anything that's doing that kind of work. I mean, like WandaVision was this meta sitcom, but I don't believe it was really about the sort of like extreme normalcy of that life, the so normal it gets weird kind of take on it. But
We'll see.
also wasn't really a comedy, I don't think.
Bruno, any last words, or shall we? I think we're at our time now. I don't want to cut
Yeah,
you off if you
good.
have something else you wanted to add.
I'm good.
Okay. Thanks, Philip. Thanks,
Thank
Bruno.
you so
This
much.
has been
Thank
really
you
enjoyable.
for inviting me and everything. This was great for
And
me too.
thanks everyone for attending. And remember, this will live on the Film Quarterly website. If you navigate there at filmquarterly.org, if you look under videos, you can find all the webinars that we've done and all the page views that we've done. And I know a lot of people are finding them really useful for teaching. So keep that in mind. Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
So long,
Thank
signing
you.
off.